Recovered file, maritime correspondence bundle, and audio index from abandoned infrastructure holdings. The file was flagged because the lighthouse on the northern shore of Lake Huron kept appearing as active in dense fog long after its electrical service had been cut. That was the first irregularity. The second was worse. The records arrived damp, with salt staining on folders that had never been near open water. The transfer notes from the dissolved records facility near Alpena said the carton was dry when sealed. Vault intake logged the same box with swollen paper, rust bleeding from staples, and a brine odor strong enough to be noted twice by separate technicians. One weather printout had a tide line across it. That should not have been possible in a land archive. The line cut through a typewritten complaint from a harbor pilot who wrote that the light was on and had been on for nearly an hour. That complaint was not isolated. Several civilian vessels reported the same thing on different fog nights, usually after midnight, usually when the shoreline could not be seen beyond a few yards. In each case, the captains described the beacon with enough confidence to make dismissal difficult. They did not agree on where it was. One vessel placed it north of charted position. Another said it appeared farther inland than any structure should have stood. A third insisted the beam swept across water the crew could hear, but not locate. Coast Guard dispatch initially treated the calls as ordinary confusion. The archived response is blunt. Visibility degraded. Chart correction advised. That line appears in more than one summary, as if copied forward without review, but the reports that follow did not resolve into a single mistaken sighting. They accumulated. Different vessel names, different times, the same light. Then another captain on another night, describing the same lighthouse as if it had never been switched off. The first hard confirmation came from a marine radio recording preserved on a damaged reel. Several minutes were lost to tape decay, but the surviving segment caught one foghorn answering another from a bearing that should have been open lake. The operators noted the problem immediately. One said the return signal was too close to be offshore and too far to be landward. The recording preserves a second horn a moment later, then a third after a pause no one could place. Those sounds were not ordinary echoes. They arrived as if another station existed beyond the charted edge of the water. The first inspection team went out after that recording. Their summary is the file's most useful document because it is plain and unwilling to speculate. The lantern mechanism was found disconnected as expected. The service lines had been cut and capped years before. Yet inside the sealed upper chamber, the inspectors documented condensation on the glass housing and a shallow pool of standing water on the floor plates. The chamber had been locked. The access seal was intact. No recent entry was recorded. The report changes tone at that point. It stops sounding routine. One inspector noted fresh corrosion on the interior railing, concentrated where spray should never have reached. Another found a damp smear on the stairwell wall at shoulder height, as if someone had climbed with wet hands. There was no sign of breach from outside, and no explanation for the water except the one the team refused to write into the body of the report. They left it in an attachment instead. Source unknown. Chamber dry on arrival, not dry inside. That would have remained a maintenance anomaly if the lighthouse had not begun to produce details from elsewhere. Tucked beneath a loose panel in the chamber, the inspectors found a folded ship log fragment with no obvious origin. The paper was sea-stiffened, but the handwriting was not theirs. It recorded fog over Lake Huron, a lighthouse beacon visible through the mist, and a position that did not match any active route. The date on the fragment was older than the lighthouse's decommissioning by many years. The file should have ended there, as a damaged and embarrassing set of mistaken reports. Instead, the water damage spread through the archive itself. A later inventory sheet shows new staining on the same folders while they were in storage, with no leak traced in the vault room. Someone wrote in pencil at the margin, "Arrived already wet." That note is the last clear mark before the records begin to disagree with one another. The lighthouse had been silent for years. The file says so. The same file also contains multiple nights when people on the lake heard it. Answer back. That contradiction is now the only stable fact. Recovered File 112, Lighthouse Activation Bundle, Coast Guard, and Harbor Authority correspondence. The beacon was already active in the first confirmed records, and it should not have been. By the time the material reached Vault 13, the paper was swollen from water no one could trace to any leak, and the earliest reports already contradicted the decommissioning record. The anomaly was not a rumor by then. It was a repeated event with a dead power line. The first confirmed activation came from Coast Guard dispatch summaries attached to harbor complaints during a dense fog advisory. Those summaries are short, and they are useful because they do not try to interpret what happened. A patrol boat off the northern shore reported a rotating beam at the abandoned lighthouse just after 1 a.m. The station checked the service history and found the light had been disconnected 14 years earlier. The dispatcher still logged the complaint as a visibility error. That dismissal did not survive the next hour. The next call came from a tug captain who gave his position with unusual care. He was not unsure of where he was. He was unsure of the lighthouse. His chart plotter placed him east of the harbor break. But the beacon he described was inland from that line. Above a low black edge, he said, looked like a cliff where no cliff should have stood. Another vessel reported the same structure from a different bearing and a different distance. Those two accounts should have cancelled each other. They did not. Both crews described a light that flashed at a steady interval and then held long enough for them to mark it, which meant they were not mistaking it for lightning, moon glare, or a reflective buoy. The chart discrepancy is what forced the first review. The Harbor Authority compared vessel tracks against fixed points and found that 3 independent logs placed the same lighthouse in 3 incompatible positions during the same fog window. One captain believed he was nearly parallel to the shoreline. Another believed he was still half a mile offshore. The third said the beam was too high for land and too low for sky. That line appears in a radio relay transcript, and it is not embellished. The operator repeated it twice because she thought she had misheard him. The strongest evidence came from the marine radio recordings made that night, which survived because the station kept an analog backup. There are gaps in the reel, but the important segment is intact enough to be hard to dismiss. The first foghorn from the lighthouse was followed by another horn, answering from a bearing the chart called open water. Then the reply came back from the opposite side of the vessel, closer than any shore station should have been. The operators began annotating bearings in the margins, as if the signals were drifting. They were not drifting. They were moving across impossible distances between each exchange. One line in the transcript has been underlined more than once by different reviewers. That horn is on the wrong side of the lake. It was spoken by a watchstander at the second station, and he said it before the crew began to argue over whether the echoes were being reflected by fog. The recording contradicts that explanation. The responses did not decay like echoes. They arrived with different timing, different pitch, and, in one instance, a delay so short that two horns sounded almost on top of one another, though no landmass existed between them. The file does not show a clean solution. It shows confusion becoming measurable. Because the reports kept coming, an inspection crew was sent out before dawn. Their arrival note records the shoreline as visibly unstable under fear, which is a poor phrase and probably a reluctant one. Once inside the lantern room, they confirmed the light source was inactive in the ordinary electrical sense. The switchgear showed no load. The feed was cut. Yet the chamber had moisture on the inside of the glass housing, and the floor plates held enough standing water to reflect the ladder rungs. The chamber had been sealed. The access hatch was intact. There was no weather breach in the metalwork, and no evidence that anyone had entered through the stairwell. The crew's notes sharpened the problem by refusing to dramatize it. One inspector measured the water depth with a rule and wrote that it was shallow but recent. Another documented fine droplets on the lens assembly, as if spray had reached the upper chamber from the inside. That is the point where ordinary maintenance language begins to fail. A disconnected lantern room does not collect fresh moisture in a sealed structure during a fog event unless there is a flaw in the seal. And the report found no such flaw. The interior was wet in a way the exterior could not explain. They also found a second physical contradiction. The stairwell walls carried a faint band of dampness at intervals corresponding to hand height on the ascent. The marks were not old stains. They had the dark, uneven edge of water that had not yet dried. The lower steps were clean. The upper half of the tower was not. A crewman noted that the wet band stopped abruptly at the locked chamber door, as if the moisture had reached a boundary and chosen not to cross it. He wrote that sentence with obvious reluctance and then crossed out the last word. The final version still remained in the file. The inspection should have ended with that. Instead, the crew recovered a folded page from beneath the lantern room grate. It was a ship log fragment, stiff with salt and carrying a different hand from the inspection notes. The handwriting was older, more angular, and badly faded at the fold. It described fog over Lake Huron, a lighthouse active in conditions where no light should have been visible, and a crew that could not agree on where the shoreline had gone. The date on the page placed it years before the light was officially shut down. That would have made it a historical curiosity if the paper had not also carried a fresh watermark across the lower edge, recent enough to glisten under the inspection lamp. The log fragment did not belong to any vessel in the active registry. Harbor Authority checked the ship name against surviving manifests and found no match. Two other fragments later recovered from the same chamber also failed to match known ships, yet they were written in different hands and on different paper stocks. One used a pencil line so light it only became visible after drying. The other was inked in a manner consistent with older marine journals. Both described the same fog bank, the same lighthouse, and the same problem with distance. They were separated by decades. They sounded like accounts from the same night. That was the moment the file stopped behaving like a collection of mistaken reports and started behaving like a place where records had been crossing into one another. The timing was still orderly on paper, but the contents were not. A maintenance report from the same week noted fresh corrosion on the brass handrail inside the tower, concentrated in streaks that matched water runoff. A structural survey taken 2 days later recorded the corrosion as if it had spread since the last visit. That should have been impossible. The tower had remained closed between visits. The surveyor wrote, "No access, yet condition advanced." The most unsettling development in this section came from the radio monitoring unit at the harbor station. During a later fog watch, operators began picking up fragmented distress calls on the emergency marine frequency. The calls were degraded but not random. They sounded like vessels naming positions that no longer existed in current charts. One transmission identified a freighter that had gone down decades earlier. Another voice, almost certainly from a different era of equipment, described the lighthouse as visible from open water where the shoreline should have been. The operators first treated the traffic as interference. Then they realized the same calls were repeating with small variations, as if copied through more than one missing night. A technician tried to align the transmissions with known vessel deaths and found that 2 of the calls came from ships that no longer appeared in the registry at all. Their names survived only in newspaper clippings and in these recordings. That should have ended the matter as a cataloging error. It did not. The radio log shows the operators hearing a horn answer the distress calls from inland, not from the harbor, from the direction of the abandoned lighthouse. The final document in this group is a maintenance note written by a worker sent back to check the tower after the first round of complaints. He was not part of the inspection crew. He was younger, more direct, and apparently less prepared to soften what he saw. His note says that during the fog event, he stood on the lower path beside the bluff and saw open water extending inland beyond the lighthouse base. He wrote that the water did not look like flooding. It looked like the lake had shifted its edge. Then the report breaks off mid-line. The last surviving words are, "The shore is not where it was." There is no attached explanation for why the note stopped there. There is only the physical file damage, which begins at that paragraph and continues through the margin. The paper is torn along a damp crease, and the missing lower half is not in the envelope. The next page in the packet is dry. That is the sharpest contradiction in the material so far. The lighthouse remained structurally fixed, electrically dead, and geographically charted in one place. Yet every serious witness who approached it during fog described the coastline moving around it, the beacon active without power, and the water answering from directions that should not have held land. The file does not explain that. It only shows that once the fog settled in, the system around the lighthouse began to fail before the lighthouse did. The last surviving line from the worker's note is the one I keep returning to. The light is still telling the water where to go. That was written before the page ended. The next layer of the file is narrower and harder to dismiss. Once the first inspections and radio captures were linked, the report stopped describing isolated confusion and began describing a repeated condition around the same structure. Every useful document from that point forward ties the problem to dense fog and to the lighthouse as a fixed point that no longer behaved like one. The light did not appear in clear weather. It appeared when visibility failed, and when it appeared, the records around it began to decay. The clearest evidence came from the hand-copied ship logs recovered from the lantern room. There were 5 fragments in all, and they were not filed together until after drying revealed that each used a different paper stock. One fragment came from a notebook with a broken spine and a date that placed it before decommissioning. Another was written on a grease-marked page cut from a commercial tide table. A third was torn from a captain's ledger, stamped with a vessel name that no longer appears in any surviving registry. What made them hard to ignore was not just the age of the paper. It was the phrasing. Each fragment described the same fog bank, the same active beacon, and the same failure of position fixing, as if copied from one account into another across years that should not have touched. One of the fragments contained a short line that archivists underlined twice. "Light seen, shore uncertain." Another said, "We passed it 3 times." A third ended with a note that the crew had heard the horn answer from behind the land. None of the fragments gave a complete course or a complete witness list. They did not need to. Their value was in their agreement on details no one would expect to recur unchanged. The same phrase about the shoreline appears in 3 of them, always in connection with fog so thick the writers could not see the bow. Harbor Authority tried to match those accounts to the surviving Weather Service logs. That comparison made the file worse, not better. The weather sheets show dense fog on the nights of the reported activations, but the timing lines do not line up cleanly. In one case, the fog bank is recorded as moving inland at a rate that would have put the lighthouse in open mist for nearly 2 hours. In another, the same station log describes a clear break at the hour. A captain later claimed the beacon remained visible. The discrepancy was not minor. It was large enough that a clerk wrote in red pencil, "Recheck station clock," and then the correction was crossed out in a hand not belonging to the clerk. I found one of the original temperature charts useful because it had a condensation ring that did not belong to the archive. The circle was faint, but it aligned with the hour of one activation event and then vanished in the next page of the bundle, as if moisture had stopped mid-transfer. The chart itself also carried a faint impression of a handprint in dried salt, palm down on the side nearest the station remarks. That handprint came from somewhere inside the records case. No one had been inside the case before intake. The intake record says the carton was sealed and dry. The chart disagrees. The radio material deepened the problem in a way the paperwork could not. Emergency marine traffic began to include fragments that were too degraded to be useful until technicians slowed them down and compared the phrasing. Then they realized that the same voices were appearing in more than one recording. Not identical copies, but partial overlaps, as if one transmission had been caught again years later with only the weather and static changed. The voices described a lighthouse in fog, but they also described shoreline features that did not belong together. One caller placed the tower beside a rocky point. Another said the same beam stood beyond marsh grass. A third mentioned open water on both sides of the light. The most disturbing of those transmissions came from a voice identified only as crew on a vessel lost decades earlier. The file contains no recovered hull for the vessel, no full casualty report, and no verified crew list. Only this partial line survives in the transcript. We can still see it. It is not on the chart now. The operator answered with a request for bearing. There was a pause. Then the voice replied, "There is no bearing. It is where the shore used to be." The recording cuts before the reply finishes. The rest of the reel is carrier noise and a single low tone that the analysis team would not name as a horn, though it clearly resembled one. That transmission became relevant because it coincided with the first measurable physical change in the lighthouse itself. Structural engineers who were sent back after the radio review noted fresh corrosion on the ladder rungs and on the underside of the lantern housing. The corrosion was not uniform. It appeared in streaks and patches, thickest near seams that had been sealed against weather exposure for years. Their report includes one photograph that the archive copy only partially preserved. The image shows the lower inner wall of the chamber with a tide line drawn across it in rust, not water stain, and the line sits too high to be explained by rain blown through an opening. The chamber was sealed when they arrived. The corrosion still looked recent. The same team also reported that the upper chamber floor held damp grit, fine enough to suggest lake sediment rather than harbor dust. They bagged a sample, but the bag later failed in storage and left a gray smear across the report sleeve. When the sleeve was opened again, a second stain had formed beneath the first. There was no leak in the archive room. The contamination seems to have traveled with the file itself. After those inspections, the lighthouse began to leave marks in places that should have been unaffected by any coastal condition. A clerk in the harbor office found a ring of moisture on a desk map of the shoreline, directly over the tower's coordinates, although the map had been stored in a metal drawer away from any window. A maintenance sheet stored beside it showed the same thing, a halo of damp paper around the lighthouse entry only. Then the entry itself blurred. Not the whole page, only that line. The rest remained legible. The line on the lighthouse went soft, as if viewed through thick water. That detail matters because it suggests the records were not simply being damaged after the fact. They were being damaged selectively. The file contains no easy explanation for why the same coordinates would collect water in dry storage, why ship logs from different decades would repeat the same impossible shoreline, or why radio traffic from lost vessels would continue to place the light in the same wrong location. The only pattern visible across all of it is that the problem strengthens whenever someone tries to fix the lighthouse in relation to the coast. The next inspection was handled by a maintenance worker named only in the margin of the form. His last name is missing from the copy I received, torn away with the bottom of the page. He was assigned to the bluff path during a fog event after local officials refused to send a full crew. The assumption was that he would check for flooding, structural shift, and any new damage to the access road. His handwritten account is short and difficult to read, but one passage stands out because it is written more carefully than the rest, as if he stopped himself from dismissing what he saw. He wrote that the lighthouse was still standing in its usual place, but the land below it was not. The shore, according to his note, had become a line he could not trust. He described a strip of open water where the slope should have continued inland, and he noted that the water had no wave pattern consistent with the lake. It was still enough to reflect the beam. Then he added that he could hear a foghorn answer from beneath the cliff. The report does not end there because the sentence was cut. It ends because the page was wet through from the middle downward, and the final third never reached the folder. The archive copy preserves only the surviving fragment of his closing line. Open water inland, no edge. The ink at the end has run as if the page had been dipped after he wrote it. That would have been severe enough on its own. What changed the file was the supplemental photograph attached to his note. The image is blurred by moisture, but the lower half shows a stretch of dark water beyond the bluff where no water exists on any chart. The surface reflects a pale vertical line that matches the lighthouse beam. There is no visible shoreline in that direction, only fog and water. The caption under the image is not the workers. It was added later by a reviewing officer who wrote only, "Field perspective unreliable during severe fog." The officer then initialed the line. The problem is that the photo was taken from an inland position. I checked the site plan against the access road. If the image is genuine, then the camera was pointed across land that should have blocked the view. If the site plan is wrong, then the archive has inherited a false shoreline. Neither option improves the case. Both make the fog event into something that does not stay on the lake. The most unsettling point in this section is that the worker did not describe panic. He described correction. He kept trying to place the shore back where he expected it to be. The last usable line in his note reads, "The light is still telling the water where to go." That sentence is the nearest thing to a conclusion in the whole file, and it is not a comforting one. The final inspection cycle began under a dense fog advisory, but the weather log was already unreliable by then. Visibility at the harbor station held at less than 100 feet for nearly an hour, then dropped out entirely for 11 minutes, then returned with a reading that did not match any nearby station. The nearest buoy report still showed calm water. The lighthouse, according to the disconnected service records, could not have been lit. It was. That fact was not first established by the caretaker's testimony. It was established by 3 onshore witnesses, all of whom saw the beam sweep the same stretch of fog at the same time, and by the fact that the beam was bright enough to reflect off wet pavement at the harbor office 2 miles away. The caretaker's assignment was meant to be routine. He had been left with periodic structural checks after local officials stopped sending crews during fog conditions. The earlier reports had made that decision sound cautious. By the end of this section, it reads as containment by denial. He arrived just after dusk with a handheld set, a lamp, and the same clipped confidence that appears in the better maintenance notes. His first transmission is still intact enough to be useful. He said the beacon was active and that the tower lantern was rotating with no power at the line. He also said the lower stairwell was damp. That part was not unusual by then. What mattered is that he repeated the sentence twice, as if confirming it to himself. The maintenance office tried to reach him by radio before he entered the tower. Their exchange is short, corrupted at the edges, and still more informative than the formal summary that followed. The office asked him to verify the switchgear. He answered that the switchgear was cold and dry, then paused long enough for static to fill the gap. After that, he said, "The light is coming from inside the fee, not from the lamp. That line is preserved only in the transcript copy. The original audio drops into carrier noise immediately after." 3 witnesses on shore reported nearly the same sequence from different positions along the bluff road. One had a field notebook, one had a dock camera, and one later gave a statement that he regretted hearing more than seeing. They all agreed on the first part. The beam crossed the harbor and struck the water beyond the expected shoreline. They did not agree on what it illuminated. One wrote that it found waves. Another said it showed a flat, dark surface farther out than the charts allow. The third refused the word surface entirely and wrote only that the light made room for something that had been hidden. That is where the file starts losing its footing. The harbor camera footage, which should have settled the matter, did not survive intact. The frame sequence jumps during the brightest part of the activation cycle. The recovered stills show fog, the tower, and a ribbon of water where there should have been stone and scrub brush along the bluff base. The final clear frame before the cut contains a shape on the water that resembles a channel marker, until one notices there are no markers in that direction. There is no follow-up image because the camera housing filled with condensation from the inside. The marine frequency recordings complicate the same event instead of clarifying it. Two vessels answered the lighthouse at roughly the same time, though they were separated by enough distance that both responses should have been impossible. One voice called out a bearing that would have taken it over land. Another reported the shoreline light moving off the chart line. Both transmissions were incomplete. Both were followed by a third signal. Not a voice, but a foghorn blast, low and close, from a position the logs identify as inland. The harbor operator wrote that he checked the rooftop direction panel twice because he believed the antenna had slipped. It had not. The readings were stable. The sound was not. The caretaker climbed the tower during that same interval. He announced the stairwell condition as he ascended, then gave position updates that became less useful the higher he went. He began by naming each landing. By the time he reached the lantern room, he was describing the fog itself as if it had replaced the walls. His breathing remained controlled until he opened the chamber door. Then the set caught his voice in fragments. He said, "The line is gone." After a pause, he added, "No, it's moved." Then, more quietly, "I can see the water from here." That sentence would not be remarkable if it stood alone. It does not. A second witness, watching from the shore through binoculars, claimed the lantern beam suddenly struck an area of open water well beyond the normal edge of the lake-facing bluff. He described the light as flattening the fog and revealing distance where there should have been none. He did not say the shore vanished. He said it stopped agreeing with itself. That wording appears in the statement exactly as he gave it. It is one of the few descriptions in the file that sounds accurate enough to be a warning. The problem is that the warning arrived too late for the records to stay coherent. The caretaker's radio traffic begins to split in the middle of his ascent. One version says he reached the top landing and found standing water along the lantern room floorboards, enough to splash under his boots. Another version, from a later and noisier copy, has him saying the floor was dry but cold. Both versions agree on the next detail. He looked out through the glass and saw open water beyond the lighthouse where the bluff should have broken the view. Neither version includes a clear statement that he understood what he was seeing. That omission matters. The file suggests he was still trying to make it fit. By the time he made his last confirmed transmission, the beam had begun to sweep across a section of fog that no longer matched any charted shoreline. He reported that the light was turning over water. He also said, with marked hesitation, that the water was reflecting him back from below. The transcript preserves only the end of that line. I can hear the horn under me. Then a long break. Then, that isn't below. After that, nothing intelligible remains. The most disturbing material in this section is not the disappearance that followed, though that is the event everyone remembers. It is the witness description collected before the tower was closed. Two officers on the bluff road said the beam briefly illuminated a stretch of open water extending past the apparent shoreline, and that for one rotation, the far edge of that water looked higher than the land. That should not have been possible from any fixed point on the coast. Their report was later amended with a single line in a different hand. Do not rely on the bluff line during fog. The amendment was unsigned. The caretaker was never recovered. That much appears in every version. But the file does not end there. The final radio fragment from his set continued to transmit after the last human voice dropped out. It was not speech. It was a series of short clicks, then a long pause, then one word spoken in a voice the recording office identified only as degraded and distant. The word was not his name. It was not a distress call. It was simply shore. After that, the recording captured the lighthouse horn again, and it sounded closer than the tower should have allowed. The access road was later closed with a weather notice that named no anomaly. The light remained off on clear nights. During dense fog, the advisory changed. It still does. Recovered File 112, Lighthouse Closure Addendum. The file was withdrawn after the caretaker disappeared, but the anomaly did not stop with him. It narrowed. The surviving papers show that the lighthouse remained officially sealed and electrically dead, yet the lakefront warnings around it became more restrictive during fog, not less. That is the first fact that matters here. The second is worse. The formal record now treats the shoreline near the tower as unreliable during dense fog, as if the coast itself had become a weather condition. The closure order is incomplete. The top page is present, signed, and routine. The attachment list is not. There should have been the final Coast Guard audio, the shore crew statements, and the post-incident engineering check. Instead, there is a damp gap in the folder where those pages ought to have been, with salt residue on the inside sleeve and no source traced. The archive intake record says the folder arrived dry. That line is still visible and it is false. What remains is enough to show that the lighthouse was not isolated by the disappearance. After the tower was sealed, marine advisories from the local district began to carry a fog clause that had not existed before. Vessels were told to avoid the northern shoreline during low visibility because charted landmarks could not be trusted within the vicinity of the abandoned light. The wording is bureaucratic, but the change is not. No one revises a navigational restriction for an empty building unless the building has continued to matter. A brief note from Harbor Authority Dispatch makes that point more directly. It reads, "Reconfirm beacon inactive status before routing." The instruction is ordinary. The timing is not. It was written after the shutdown order and then copied again 2 days later in a weather bulletin, as though the office had become unwilling to assume the light would stay dark. I found 3 instances of that phrase in the closing correspondence. Each one was attached to a different fog advisory. None of them named the lighthouse, but every one of them pointed to it. The most troubling surviving document is a satellite shoreline survey filed weeks after the caretaker's loss. The survey was later flagged for a mapping discrepancy near the tower bluff. In the copied image, the landline appears briefly offset, then corrected, then offset again only in the fog band over the lake. The analyst who reviewed it wrote that the defect was likely caused by atmospheric distortion. Below that, in a different pen, someone added, "Not in the land parcel, in the water." That annotation was crossed out and left in the file anyway. I should note that the official engineering closure found nothing physically active in the tower. The lantern mechanism remained disconnected. The switchgear showed no fresh power draw. The structure itself was secure. That did not prevent the warnings. It did not prevent the fog reports. It did not prevent one more fragment of audio from being entered into the record under an access denial stamp. The transcript is too damaged to support a full recovery, but one phrase survives cleanly. The voice on it said, "It is still answering." That phrase appears after the file was closed, which means it should not exist at all. It is not connected to any approved recording chain, and the originating reel was never released from storage. I do not have the reel. I do not have the missing pages. I do not have the caretaker's final body, or the shore crew's full statements, or the original dispatch tape that was later withheld. What I do have is a pattern that became more cautious, not less, after the tower was sealed. The last item in the folder is a handwritten restriction slip placed by a later archivist. It says only, "Do not request the fog nights." There is no signature. There is no date. There is, however, a smear across the bottom edge of the paper that appears to have been made by wet fingers. The file remains incomplete, but the surviving facts are not ambiguous. The lighthouse was decommissioned, then repeatedly reported active in fog, then sealed after the caretaker vanished. The navigational restrictions around it persist. The power remains off. The warnings remain in place. The light, according to the materials, did not return by accident. It was still being used. This concludes the recovered file. May future listeners take caution in its implications. The Archivist, Vault 13.